As Delius made his way to the upper levels of the tech facility he was housed in, somewhere that he had never gone before. All through the facility as he passed, he could see people crouching under desks and tables, hiding behind walls. Most of them simply unarmed scientists and workers who had jobs at the establishment, cooks, technical support, people to answer phones, hardly armed soldiers. Most were too scared to even notice Delius coming through. The few that did immediately recognized him, and though they were still somewhat overcome with fear, suddenly their astonishment took its place. Some of them even crawling off from under the desks and from behind the walls that they hid behind, simply watching in awe as he walked absolutely fearlessly towards the exit of the compound. As Delius finally reached the top level, the sound of gunfire and explosions getting louder by the moment, Delius entered the front section of this scientific facility, the entranceway. There ahead of him, he could see hardened armor gates had locked down, and there were a few soldiers inside, pointing guns out through fire ports, shooting wildly, as a few men in the background stood with equipment, yelling into devices, a few of which actually noticed Delius approaching and began running towards him with their hands up, yelling in a language that Delius couldn't understand, pointing in the opposite direction. In the moment, he supposed they were telling him to go back, turn the opposite direction, most likely because of, all of the firearms, explosions and bullets, things like that most sane people want to stay far, far away from. But even these armored figures, as they approached, rambling in a language that he couldn't understand, suddenly began to slow both their pace and their speech as they got closer and began to get a closer look at Delius, and just like the others before them, suddenly fell astonished, dumbfounded, no longer trying to stop him, simply looking at him as he passed by them, approaching the front sealed gates, covered with a hardened steel surface, from which he could hear the ringing of firearms bouncing off of it, large dents being placed inside of it. Delius turned around for a moment, looking at the armored individuals behind him. "Open it," Delius said, very sternly as he looked at them. One of the men seemed to know Delius's language. Yes, of course. Men, move out of the way. I mean, gibbering off in this strange language that Delius didn't know, as the man began to shuffle about, moving out of the way of the primary door, including the equipment, before activating a system on the interior wall as the main gate, the entrance door, began to unshutter, opening up. And as it did, there was a rain of bullets that came flying through, that Delius paid no heed to, walking directly out of the doors as they began to open, bullets and energy rounds bouncing off of him as he passed. And as he exited through the doors, they closed once again behind him. As Delius walked outside, for the first time since he had been on this world, exiting the facility for the first time since he had been on this world, he saw above him an expansive blue sky, as a shimmering blue light from a star hanging overhead shined down on everything, tinting it a tinge of blue, and scenery that would normally be somewhat picturesque. What looked like what used to be a beautiful garden, complete with trees and shrubs, a well-manicured lawn of sorts. Nothing that Delius was used to seeing, but to the average individual would seem quite picturesque, if not for the fact that it were not currently in shambles, most of it blown to hell. All around him, near the facility, the last of the few remaining guards for the facility ducked behind any barrier or cover that they could. Rains of bullets and energy weapon projectiles firing at them, as there wasn't even any time to peek their head outs. Simply too much firepower going all at once. Delius looked out beyond that to see swarms of soldiers, heavy armored units, and a large ship hanging overhead, and without any hesitation whatsoever, began to rush for it, full bore. His speed was not something that they were expecting, as within only a second or two, he had already made it into the primary swarm of foot soldiers, standing right in front of a soldier carrying a high round per second weapon, who in a sheer panic began to unload on Delius at point-blank range, all of the bullets simply bouncing off of him harmlessly, as he reached out, grabbing the assault weapon, and with a single grip, crushing it, the weapon bending like a toothpick in his grasp. Extending a single arm, Delius threw one punch directly to the individual's core. The armor plating he was wearing buckled under the impact as he flew right off of his feet, flying back dozens of feet before rolling across the ground sporadically. In the moment, the nearby soldiers began to react, firing on Delius from all angles, but all of it was useless. No matter how many rounds they hit him with, it didn't even faze him. Delius walked up to the closest soldier near him, reaching out and grabbing him by the head. He seemed to be wearing some sort of hardened armor helmet, which Delius's fingers crushed into without the slightest bit of effort, pulling the soldier from his feet, reeling his hand back just a bit, and with a flick of his wrist throwing him through several other soldiers. Now, most of the soldiers close to him out of ammunition. A few of them were foolish enough to try to confront Delius hand to hand. With almost no effort at all, Delius began striking them down one after another. A single hit was all it took. For the first man, a downward strike planted him into the ground, leaving him in his own private little crater. The second soldier got a backhand to the side of his body, sending him flying into a stone structure meant to hold in a large tree that cracked and shattered under the impact of his body after the backhand sent him flying into it. As Delius looked out, a large number of the soldiers nearby were standing by somewhat of a metal guardrail that extended for a great distance, and that most of the men were fairly close to, as they had just been using it for cover, as they fired on the units there to protect the facility. With a bit of quick thinking, Delius quickly grabbed this railing, and with a slight pull upwards, a lift and a pull is all it took to rip the entire railing the length down, all the way to the concrete embankment that it was affixed to. And once again, with a flick of his wrist, he whipped this entire metal railing like a steel rope, sending it clattering into the sides of nearly a dozen soldiers, sending them flying in the opposite direction. As Delius released the railing and began checking to make sure that the foot soldiers that it hit had all been sufficiently injured to stay down, Delius found himself being struck by something strong enough to actually make him budge. The impact was hard and exceptionally powerful, a burst of energy that forced his shoulder back a bit, As he stumbled 1 or 2 steps, it didn't hurt, but it definitely got his attention as he looked over in the direction that the shot came from to see one of the large armored units with a massive single-arm cannon firing shots off at him. "Well, I suppose you're next," Delia said as he glared in its direction.